Was childhood in ancient Egypt playful, harsh, or just far more grown up than we expect? The common picture is simple. Children in ancient societies either lived in total freedom or worked like miniature adults every waking second. But a normal day usually turned on timing, chores, weather, and whatever the household had the strength to finish before dark. If you followed an ordinary person from the moment the day began to the moment it ended, the biggest surprise would not be how exotic everything looked. It would be how structured life already was, even without the tools we now treat as basic. So rather than looking at the grand version of history, let us stay close to the floorboards, the street, the field, and the kitchen, and follow the day as it unfolded. Morning began with immediate demands, not a slow start. A child's day began inside the family rhythm, not outside it. Children woke in the same house world as everyone else, around food preparation, water jars, work talk, and adult movement. Clothing could be minimal in the heat, especially for younger children, and the household itself was the first school, because there was no separate world built to cushion children from adult reality. The opening chores were less about preference and more about keeping the day from sliding off course. Small delays early on mattered more when the whole day depended on daylight, fuel, and muscle. Moments like this also carried quiet decision-making. People were constantly judging effort, risk, timing, and whether the household could absorb one more problem. This is exactly where the era comes back to human scale. The famous headlines stayed far away, while regular bodies handled the actual burden of the day. After that first burst of activity, the harder part of the day took over. Chores came early. Children fetched water, watched younger siblings, ran messages, scared birds from fields, and helped with tiny, repeatable tasks that adults did not have time to ignore. That did not mean every moment was miserable. It meant usefulness began young, and being useful was one of the clearest ways a child learned where they fit. What counted as work was broader than a modern job description. That workload could look simple only to someone who did not have to live inside it every day. This is exactly where the era comes back to human scale. The famous headlines stayed far away, while regular bodies handled the actual burden of the day. What looks small from a distance often decided whether the rest of the day felt manageable. That is why ordinary routines deserve more attention than the stereotype usually gives them. Here the modern stereotype starts to wobble. Learning happened mostly through imitation. A child copied gestures, songs, craft motions, and household routines long before anything like formal teaching appeared. Elite children might learn reading and writing in a more organized way, but for most families, the real curriculum was memory, obedience, and learning how not to make life harder for the people around you. People often underestimated these routines only because they no longer had to do them. What looks plain to us often depended on knowledge that took years to build. What looks small from a distance often decided whether the rest of the day felt manageable. That is why ordinary routines deserve more attention than the stereotype usually gives them. Seen up close, learn by copy was not just a visual detail. It shaped mood, behavior, and the amount of strain people had to absorb before the day was done. By this point, daily life was being felt in muscles, clothing, weather, and hunger. Childhood also carried ordinary ancient risks. Illness, injury, heat, dirty water, and poor luck could shape a family's emotional life very quickly. That is part of why ancient parents often looked both practical and affectionate at the same time. Love existed, but it had to live beside constant uncertainty about whether a child would stay healthy enough to reach adulthood. Bodies, clothing, weather, and fatigue were part of the calculation all day long. A lot of what seems harsh now was simply the accepted cost of keeping life going. Seen up close, not guaranteed, was not just a visual detail. It shaped mood, behavior, and the amount of strain people had to absorb before the day was done. That is why details like childhood risk and care mattered so much. They were part of the real pressure of the day, not decorative background somebody could safely ignore. Work was only part of the story because social rules pressed in at the same time. Social class mattered enormously. A wealthy child and a farming child did not grow into the same future, and everyone around them knew that. Family expectation, religion, and obedience shaped childhood heavily, which meant play could exist, but it existed inside a world already preparing children for adult rank, labor, and duty. Rank, gender, age, and reputation often shaped the routine as much as pure necessity did. People were managing judgment, expectations, and power at the same time they were managing chores. That is why details like class difference in childhood mattered so much. They were part of the real pressure of the day, not decorative backgrounds somebody could safely ignore. The last part of the day tied the whole rhythm together. Evening probably felt closest to what we would recognize as family time. Stories, songs, food, small amusements, and simple closeness had room to appear once the hardest tasks eased off. But childhood in ancient Egypt was never built around endless protected leisure. It was built around growing into a household that needed your hands, your memory, and your place in its routine. Even rest usually sat beside unfinished work or tomorrow's preparation. That closing stretch often said more about the period than any famous event could. If you slow the scene down, the routine becomes easier to read. Most people were not performing for history. They were trying to keep ordinary life from slipping out of control. Seen as one full routine, what childhood was actually like in ancient Egypt becomes less theatrical and far more believable. Ancient Egyptian childhood mixed affection, chores, imitation, risk, and an early education in what the household needed. The past becomes far easier to understand once you see how regular people moved through an ordinary day. When you stay with the routine instead of the legends, the whole period becomes easier to picture.